Hello, welcome to a discussion about Namazake. My name is Ollie Johnson and I'm the director of a company called Tengu Sake. We supply the on and off trades here in the UK and also have a website, tengusake.com, where we have the ability to sell directly to the consumer. So we try and cover as much as possible. Recently, during this very bizarre COVID-19 lockdown situation, I've been running some online Zoom tastings, which have proved to be very popular, and people have asked me to put these online. So I've decided to re-record the particular session so I can make it more concise. So anyway, without further ado, the first session we had was about Namazake. So let's talk about that. Nama means unpasteurized, and Zake means sake. So it's unpasteurized, raw, untreated, unheat treated sake. Most sake that's produced in Japan is pasteurized sake. So it is heat treated, and we'll discover why you might do that. But there's also a significant amount of sake that's produced. Often it's often released immediately after production, so after winter. So first releases of Namazake might be in November, right at the beginning of production, all the way through round to spring. And there's a special type of Namazake that's even released after summer in the autumn, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So without further ado, let's move on. When I did the online tasting, we tried Gozenshu's new product. So it's called Gozenshu 1859 prototype. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but it's a lovely Namazake if you want to try it. Some information is on the screen now. Do try if you have the ability, although I don't think they're going to repeat this particular sake anymore. There will be a new Namazake that comes out from Gozenshu in the 1859 brand, under the 1859 brand, but it's not going to be this prototype one. So if you can get your hands on a bottle, you will be one of the lucky few to try it before it goes. Okay, so the obvious question is, why is sake pasteurized? Why bother pasteurizing sake? So let me show you an image. This is an image of a fermentation tank. So it's quite a big tank. It's much bigger than a human. You've got to climb up a big ladder to get to it. It contains many thousands, well, not many thousands, but many litres of sake. It's called the moromi, the main fermentation of the sake. And from this image, you can see, because the tank is pretty full, that we're pretty near the end of the fermentation process. We've certainly done the final addition. So there's after fermentation has finished, the next step will be to press the sake, so to remove the liquid stuff you want to drink from the lees, the stuff you don't want to drink, the solids. Now within the moromi, there's fermented rice and obviously sake. There's lots of microbial activity going on. So lots and lots of living things. And we'll delve into what those might be in a second. But if these microbes are not removed, then the reactions that they cause will continue to take place. So even when you take them out of this particular tank and put them somewhere else, microbes might still be in there, and so they will continue. So the first thing we're going to do is press the sake. And when you press sake, you've got a number of different options, but the principle is the same. You want to, as I say, remove the liquid from the lees. So standard filtration, because it's we call it pressing, but it is essentially a filtration where you are filtering out the liquid away from the solids. And standard filtration removes most insoluble material. Yeah, so looking at the previous photo, that would be the large rice particles. It also removes some yeast, but not all yeast. Some yeast will pass through. Now you could go tighter, as in use a finer mesh in order to filter the sake, and indeed that sometimes does happen. And so you could do something called sterile filtration, and that requires less than half a micron filter mesh in order to do that. Now this will remove anything that's alive, so any of the alive ingredients. So that is, let's say yeast or bacteria. They will go, and that's why we call it sterile filtration. But of course, what you won't get rid of are the enzymes that are also present in that mixture. But you can do ultrafiltration, but you need to go down to 1/100th of a micron to get ultrafiltration. And that's finally when you remove these enzymes that are knocking around from the koji. So why on earth don't we just ultrafilter everything? Why don't we just crack on and ultrafilter all the alive ingredients out of the sake and make it inert? Well, the problem is, if you do that, you're going to filter all the interesting things out of the sake that make the sake exciting. Aroma compounds, flavour compounds. And so overfiltration takes a terrible toll on the sake. And that's why we rely on standard filtration, which removes that insoluble material and does a pretty good job of removing a fair amount of the yeast. Okay, cool. So we do that, but then we also use pasteurisation to deal with the things that pass through the mesh. So what exactly does pass through the mesh? Well, we end up with a liquid that comes out of pressing that has a hazy appearance. And what's that hazy appearance? It's going to be a bit of starch, it's going to be insoluble protein, and it's going to be yeast. And you can see these things. That's what contributes to the hazy appearance. But additionally, there are other bits and bobs. Got bacteria, various forms of bacteria, but also particularly the ones we're interested in are lactic acid bacteria. The bad ones are called hyochikin in Japanese. And also enzymes. You can't see these. Now the alive things in that are the yeast, the bacteria, and the enzymes. I'm not so worried about the starch and the insoluble proteins, because we can just allow those to settle gently, and over time they'll settle to the bottom of the tank and we can rake off the clear liquid from the top. But that clear liquid, unpasteurised liquid, will still contain all these alive organisms, microbes, that are going to be continuing to do what they do. And they are the yeast, the bacteria, and the enzymes. And if we leave them just to continue to do what they do, the yeast will continue to ferment. So you're going to get more alcohol. And in a sake bottle, a closed sake bottle, after you've exhausted the oxygen, you're going to be doing anaerobic fermentation as well. So you're going to be getting more lactic acid and more alcohol. The bacteria are going to continue to do whatever they're doing. Particularly the lactic acid bacteria are going to continue to make more lactic acid. And that results in an unbalanced sake and off flavours. And indeed, if you expose these hyochikin, the bad lactic acid bacteria, to UV light, it results in a very distinct kind of these kind of cloudy strings you see suspended in the sake. And it leads to production of a compound called diacetyl, which gives you these kind of butterscotchy aromas and flavours, which are really not particularly nice. And finally, you've got your enzymes, which will give you over maturity. So the enzymes, which are coming from the koji, are doing a couple of things. If you know your basics of sake production, you will understand that koji, which is a fungus, its function in the chemistry of sake is predominantly to convert the starch, which is locked up in the rice, complex carbohydrate, convert that complex carbohydrate starch into simple carbohydrate sugar, so that the yeast then has food to convert to alcohol when it ferments. That's the function of koji predominantly, and so it does that by secreting these enzymes, and so the enzymes that remain will continue to break down the starch that's in the pressed sake. They'll break down that starch into sugar, and as well as that, koji also secretes enzymes that breaks proteins down into amino acids, peptides. Sugar and amino acids are a lovely, lovely food for the bacteria that we've already talked about. So that creates an environment where those bacteria can continue to flourish and multiply, and so it contributes to the increase of flavours. But also, those two amino acids and sugars will react with one another, and through the Maillard reaction, the residual sugar and the sugar and the amino acids will react and create richer, deeper flavours, and so will contribute to this taste and perception of over maturity. Melanoidin is the compound that results from the Maillard reaction, and gives you this impression of rich, deep flavour. Okay, so that's what's left after standard pressing, and the alive things, the yeast, the bacteria, and the enzymes, that's what will happen if you just leave them hanging about. And so you've got to be careful with Namazake, with unpasteurised sake, so that these things don't happen. So when I did the presentation, one of the questions was, well, how come you don't get all these off flavours in Namazake? Indeed you do if you don't store it correctly, and this is why it's so important to store Namazake correctly. Namazake, the yeast, the bacteria, the enzymes, all of those will only really be rendered absolutely inert at a very cold temperature. So quite often people store Namazake commercially, you know, as in breweries and maybe along the distribution chain at -5, because we know that that's going to lock all those reactions down, and it's not going to be possible for these developments to take place. But if you've got it in just a commercial fridge around about 2 to 5 degrees centigrade, that even though it's cold, those reactions will continue to take place, which is why, very slowly, but continue to take place, which is why Namazake has this short shelf life. And of course, if you don't refrigerate Namazake, it's surprisingly rapid how quickly you can note off flavours occurring. Now, there are some breweries who are experimenting with aging, maturing Namazake, and so just a gentle nod to them. These are kind of general rules. There are obviously exceptions to those rules. So that's what happens with Namazake. That's why it's important to keep it cold. So, of course, the principle of pasteurisation is to prevent that spoilage. So it's very simple. Why do we pasteurize sake? We pasteurize it to destroy the microorganisms and inactivate the enzymes. And how do we do that? Essentially, we heat the sake up to 65 degrees centigrade for around 10 minutes. There are different ways of doing it. Not everyone does that. It's not necessary to do that. And you do it, you can do it at its most basic level in a tank. So the tank that the sake sits in to just be held or mature. That whole thing can be heated up. But as you can imagine, that's not great because you've got a large volume of liquid to heat up, and also you're heating different bits of it up at different temperatures, and there's a lot of liquid to heat. You can do it in line, so you can pass the sake through a pipe, through hot water. Again, that's not great. So you can do it through a heat exchange, and the heat exchange is kind of like a flash pasteurizer. It'll heat the sake up to your desired temperature, say 65 degrees, and then plunge it back down again. That's a good way of doing it. And then the most common method, I wouldn't say necessarily the most common method, but the most common method for jizake, which is boutique sake, is in the bottle. So the sake is pressed, popped in the bottle, and then the bottle itself is exposed to the temperature, the desired temperature. So the sake would then heat up, is held, and then is cooled down. That's obviously controlled quite carefully, and even then there's a number of different ways of doing that, with putting it in baths of hot water and then cold water, or putting it through kind of showers on a conveyor belt, or all sorts of different ways of pasteurizing. And pasteurization is quite technically complex. You can ruin a sake by over pasteurizing, or knackering it by exposing it to a lot of heat. And of course, exposing it to heat also speeds up any reactions that are going on within it. So oxygenization will speed up, and Maillard reaction will speed up, all those sorts of things. And so you've got to be quite careful. Anyway, so moving back onto Namazake, we talked about why you pasteurize sake and why you, and so let's explore why you would not pasteurize sake. What's fun about Namazake? So Namazake, to remind you, is unpasteurised sake. So there's lots of positive and exciting adjectives we can use to describe it, and quite often the ones I use, the ones I encounter, result in kind of the active nature of the sake. It's fresh, and lively, and youthful, and zesty, effervescent. It can also be described as brash and bold, unsubtle, untamed, and these might have negative connotations, but personally, I quite like calling Namazake brash or untamed, because it kind of is, that's why we like it. It's got that kind of bonkers, bright, bold, zesty nature to it. Some of the aromas, there's usually quite an obvious lactic component to Namazake, a kind of cheesy aroma, and this can be dialed way up, and when it's extremely high, sometimes it's a bit much. I quite like that lactic aroma, but it's generally there in some level or another. The fruit that's quite often noticeable with Namazake is usually quite juicy, quite round, and quite juicy, exciting. There's often nut aromas like chestnut or fresh grass, freshly cut grass, and umami, that kind of savory aroma as well. So you might get some kind of my go-to is kind of Marmite. That's a very British-centric thing to say. Soy or toffee, or that sort of thing that you can smell on the back end. It's not at the forefront, but it's there. Really, it's this bright, bold character that you're getting from Namazake. That's why people like it. Off flavors, if you start getting garlic, onion, sauerkraut, caramel, butterscotch, or sweat, those kind of aromas in your Namazake, these are classic aromas that will signal to you that, first of all, it probably won't be that nice to drink, but also signal to you that those three elements have been allowed to continue. Remember, the enzymes, the bacteria, and the yeast have allowed to continue to do what they do, and they've resulted in these aroma compounds. Okay, and that's not very nice. That's a good way to know that sake is, particularly Namazake, is over the hill. So Namazake in general, lots of people like it because it's exciting. Imagine like a natural wine or an orange wine that has that kind of brash, almost kind of effervescent, exciting component to it. Lots of people like Namazake for that. That's what I like Namazake for. It's awesome. But some of the criticism that people direct towards Namazake is that because of that kind of brash nature, that's what you get. And all Namazake is not much of a muchness, but it's all Namarish, right? I mean, there's a spectrum within that, but still, it's Nama. You can get, that's Namazake most of the time. And that Nama-ness puts an almost a veil or a duvet over the top of the underlying sake. And so what you get is the Nama first, and everything else is under there somewhere, and you can't necessarily find it. Once you pasteurize the sake, that Nama-ness, that veil is lifted, or that duvet is lifted, and you can access the nuance below. And so whilst Namazake is fantastic and really exciting and a dynamic drink, there's also plenty of room for pasteurized sake because it allows you to enjoy this nuance and this delicacy that Namazake generally doesn't afford you, because there's much more, its watchwords are this brash, bold style. So my recommendation is to try both. If you can get a Nama version of a particular sake and a pasteurized version of a particular sake and try them side by side, you'll discover different things between the two, and they'll both be awesome. So it's fun. Now, of course, always with sake, things are always complex, and so let's spend some time looking at this. As I think you can hopefully see, this is not my graphic. I nicked this off Sake Talk, which is a great website if you want to go check them out. They've got lots of graphical representations of sake terminology, which makes it easy to understand. So historically, there's been two pasteurizations of sake. One after fermentation, so one after the Muromi, if you remember, that's that big tank. One after it's been pressed. So that's the first pasteurization, right about here. And then the second pasteurization is usually after a maturation period, if that indeed takes place, before bottling. Unpasteurized, so there's those two pasteurization moments. Unpasteurized sake, Namazake, is without any pasteurization whatsoever. Yeah, so that's usually just called Namazake. But if you want to be absolutely sure that it's completely Nama, they might emphasize it by saying Namazake or Hon Namazake. Hon means authentic or real. Yeah, so Hon Namazake. And that's what we've been talking about in this presentation. Now, there are two other types of Namazake, Namazume, Namachozo. So, if you press your sake and then you pasteurize it, and then you pop it either in bottle or you've done it in the tank, which is historically how it would have been done, it's in the tank, and then you mature that sake, pasteurize, so you pasteurize it once, and then you mature that sake for a period of time, and then either you bottle it because it's in the tank, or if it's already in the bottle, you just ship it without the second pasteurization. That's called Namazume. We'll come back to that in a second. The alternative is Namachozo. Chozo means storage. So what you've done here is you've pressed the sake, you've either put it into a maturation tank or you've put it into the bottle, but you haven't pasteurized it. And then wherever it is sitting, either in the bottle or in the tank, it matures for a period of time. Unpasteurized, that's why it's called Namachozo, unpasteurized storage. Then you pasteurize it, and then either bottle it if it's in the tank or just ship it if it's already in the bottle. So that's the distinction there. Namazume is pasteurized, matured, shipped. Namachozo is unpasteurized, matured, pasteurized, shipped. Okay. Of course, if you store sake unpasteurized for a period of time, then depending upon the temperature you store it at, those reactions that we've been discussing will proceed. And so you'll get a maturation of the sake that is much, much, much more rapid and noticeable than if you pasteurize the sake and mature it. Okay, so those are terms to look out for: Namachozo, Namazume. Now it gets a little bit complicated because pressing technology combined with pasteurization technology is so good now, and the skill of skilled brewers is so advanced now that quite often people only pasteurize once anyway. So it makes this whole distinction a little bit complicated. But if you think about the essence of what's being tried to achieve, even if they're pasteurizing once, it's still, you can still understand. Either they're trying to mature it in a Nama state to mature it more rapidly and then pasteurize it and ship it, or they're trying to, they're not trying to do that. They're trying to pasteurize it and ship it ASAP without any kind of maturation, or indeed mature it whilst it's pasteurized. But the point is that Namachozo will mature more rapidly because it's unpasteurized. Okay, So the final thing to draw your attention to is we've talked about Namazake, Namazume, beg your pardon, Namazume, which is when it is pasteurized and then stored pasteurized. Now this traditionally, historically, was a special type of sake. So it was completed, remember sake is fermented, created, brewed, got there in the end, brewed during the winter. And so this style of sake, which is called hiya oroshi, this style of sake, which is a namazume, was completed at the end of winter, just as the trees started to regrow their leaves. So coming out of winter and into spring. Yeah, it's still cold though. So it's completed just at that moment. It's then pressed, pasteurized once, and popped into storage, where it remains over the warm summer months. So through spring, through summer, where it gets really quite warm, but the brewery with its thick walls is still cool. It's maturing, once pasteurized. Then, when the temperature, the summer temperature, the ambient temperature outside, starts to come down, and gets to the same level as the cold brewery or the cool brewery, that's when hiya oroshi is released, so that the temperature outside is as cool as the temperature inside. So when the sake comes out of the brewery, it remains at a similar, if not the same temperature, so it doesn't go whoop up in temperature and get spoiled because it's only been through that one pasteurization. Again, it's a bit of a historical term, and as I was saying earlier, pasteurization technologies come on so far now that one pasteurization is sufficient, but nonetheless, that's the principle of hiya oroshi, to guard against any spoilage, because the temperature of the brewery when the sake is released in the autumn or the fall is the same temperature as the outside, the brewery and the outside are the same, so there's no shock to the sake. So that's called hiya oroshi, hiya meaning cool, and oroshi meaning shipping. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to this presentation. It's a very quick half-hour rundown of Namazake. I'm sure I've missed out lots of bits and bobs and forgotten a few things, but I've tried to give it a relatively concise going over and delve into the reasons why we pasteurize, why we don't pasteurize, and the different characteristics between those two styles of sake. What is left to you is to buy and taste both of these styles, see what you like, see what you enjoy. If I can be any help with any suggestions, then please do drop me a line. Tengusake.com is our website. Have a look on the website. Email address is on there, contact@tengusake.com. Happy to advise. And if you're in the UK, you can even get stuff directly from our website, shipped to you, and you can try it yourself. We've got lots of Namazake and lots of pasteurized sake. Thank you very much.